Say that I'm very pleased to be following the NDP member from Churchill, and after her very powerful and passionate speech on this issue. So I know that this is an issue that we all care very deeply about. Mr. Speaker, I want to begin my remarks, and I know I don't have much time. I want to begin my remarks by reflecting on a very important event that's going to take place in the downtown east side, right at Main and Hastings today. Today will be the 22nd annual Women's Memorial March that has taken place in that community. I attended the first march in 1991 when I was still a city councillor, and it was really the first time that the community came together in an outpouring and a recognition of the terrible violence that was taking place in the community, where Aboriginal women were missing, and many were murdered, presumed murdered, many were sex workers. And I remember the march along Powell Street, and we began next to a dumpster where earlier the body parts of a murdered woman had been found, and I won't use her name because her family has asked that her name not be used. And I remember as we walked down the street, Powell Street, Dundas Street, down to Main and Hastings to the Carnegie Centre, and there was a ceremony, a smudge ceremony, and her family were there. And it was the first time in the downtown east side that there was a public coming together in recognition of what was taking place in that community. That was 1991. Many women had been disappearing prior to that. And it was at that point that the community started calling for a public inquiry in BC into the missing and murdered women, because we all knew and believed that there was a serial killer that was likely responsible. Well, here we are 2 decades later, and of course much has happened. There have been criminal trials, the largest mass murder trial in Canada, the Picton trial. We've had the Opal Commission. We've had the United Nations begin its own inquiry into the status and the missing and murdered Aboriginal women. And so here we are today debating this motion, and I think it's an important step, and it looks like that this motion would be passed today, which I think is good. But I want to remember the women in the downtown east side and to thank the organizers for what they're doing today. Marlene George, who's the chair of the committee, and many other women who have been involved in this issue, and even though they were grieving for the loss of family members, refused to be silenced and refused to be placated. And I think what I've learned from this issue is that it's probably the greatest tragedy that we've seen in the downtown east side, and the community is still feeling the grief of what's taken place. But I've also learned that the huge systemic issues that are involved are something that we simply cannot ignore. And so I believe that we all have a responsibility. Primarily governments have a responsibility, but whether it's municipal, provincial, or federal, we all have a responsibility to come to terms with what has taken place. And I think in coming to terms, we do have to face the grievous injustices facing Aboriginal people, especially women, and we have to respond in a way that acknowledges and understands the historic racism, inequality, poverty, and discrimination that's resulted from a long history of colonialism in Canada. And unless we can begin from that place of that understanding, then I worry and I fear that we won't have learned what it is we need to learn in order to move forward. So that's one very important principle to me, is the understanding of the root causes. The second thing is to understand that society has failed these women at every single level, whether it's judicial, whether it's political, whether it's cultural. No matter what way you look at it, society has failed these women. These women were marginalized, and I'm speaking primarily about the downtown east side, but as we know, there are 600 women who are also missing and may be murdered across the country. these women became so marginalized, they became like non-people. And so their disappearances were never taken seriously. And of course, yes, now we have the reports and we have the analysis of what went wrong. And still there's some finger pointing of, you know, the RCMP, the Vancouver Police, and other forces in other parts of the country, police forces. So I think that's the second most important thing, is to understand how everything failed. You know, we expect our governments, we expect our society, the programs we have, the values we have as Canadians, to be able to take care of people when they're hurting. And yet in this instance, especially in the downtown east side, because most of the women were sex workers, they were just dismissed. They weren't taken seriously when they disappeared, when their family members made complaints. So we have a lot to learn. I attended the Opal Commission when they released their report on December 17th, so not very long ago. And although there were many, many criticisms about the Opal Commission process and the inquiry, and the fact that many community organizations didn't have the legal standing and resources that they needed to participate in the inquiry, nevertheless, that report is there, and I think it compels all of us to ensure that these recommendations are followed up. And when I spoke to Justice Opal before the Commission actually began its formal work, what I said to him, and what I still believe today, that the most important aspect of his work was a way to ensure that whatever recommendations he came up with would not be forgotten, that they wouldn't just sort of sit somewhere. And we've seen that with many reports, unfortunately. I mean, you can go back to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996. I think it was a 3-volume document. Most of those recommendations have never been followed up. So what I want to say today is that if we have a unanimous will of this House, and it looks like we do, and that's good, to set up a special committee, then we have to make a commitment to the community, to those families, that we will actually make it meaningful, and that it won't be a special committee that, you know, kind of does the routine stuff, but it actually has to be a process that is going to look at the other reports, the recommendations. We heard the parliamentary secretary say earlier that she believes that the Opal Commission recommendations should be looked at as they pertain to the federal government. That's certainly very important. But I think we have to make a commitment that we are willing to look at outcomes, real outcomes, in terms of the judicial system, in terms of poverty, income inequality, racism, discrimination, the standing of women in our society, and particularly the standing of Aboriginal women. So that's something that we have the power to do, both individually and collectively and through our political parties. So I'm glad that this motion is being debated today. It is a step. As you've heard from the member from Churchill, we too believe that there should be a national public inquiry, and we won't give up on that. And I'm sure that the people in the community are not going to let us forget that. They won't let us forget that. But we have an immediate task, it appears, to set up this special committee. So in the memory of the women in the downtown east side, and to all of the activists and the family members and people who are there today at Main and Hastings gathering at noon, and there'll probably be more than 5,000 people, I want to say from myself, but from my colleagues, that we give that commitment. We won't let go of this issue. We will press for justice. We will work in a genuine, meaningful way, and we will make sure that the community voices are heard, because they know the truth. They know the truth. They know what needs to be done. And in a way, we have to give our leadership, but we also have to understand their leadership and work in cooperation to make sure that those changes do come about. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Saint...
The honourable member for Saint-Maurice-Champlain. I thank my colleague for Vancouver East, who's very familiar with this problem. I thank her for her speech and comments. I'd like to ask her how she analyzes the lack of results. She said at one point, society has abandoned these women. Despite all the studies, all the research, all the reports that have been issued, why is it, in her opinion, that society has abandoned these women and nothing's ever been done?
Honourable Member for Vancouver East.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think that's a very important question, and I think it speaks to power in our society and who is heard and who isn't. You know, you're a sex worker in the downtown east side, you're a poor Aboriginal woman in a northern community. The system doesn't respond. Politicians don't respond. So I do think we have a conscience that we have to reflect upon about what's taken place. I would ask my honourable colleagues why it is that the Liberals waited until the Conservatives were in power to call for this special committee when they themselves in the motion say that it's gone on for 3 decades. So this is something that we all have to reflect on. It's not, you know, it's never too late to do something, but I think we have to find answers to those questions that she raises and make sure that a special committee and hopefully at some point a national public inquiry can bring justice and can bring answers to these questions that are being raised.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. L'honorable député.
Honourable member for La Salle-et-Mar. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.